Welcome to the 2022 DiLCo lecture series on digital language and communication. I'm Yanis Androutsopoulos from the University of Hamburg. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context, initiated in 2021. It's coordinated from Hamburg by my colleague Heike Zinsmeister and myself, and currently includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme funded by the German federal government and the federal states. DiLCo aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics and to bridge gaps between qualitative and quantitative research methods. To this purpose, DiLCo is organizing online and on-site activities such as conference panels, methods workshops, and this DiLCo lecture series. Our lectures showcase cutting-edge international research by senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in social cultural linguistics such as community, context, identity, interaction, style, multimodality, and others to shed light on digital communication. We are recording these lectures to build up a repository that is available open access from Hamburg University's video portal Lecture2Go. As in the past, each lecture is about 40 or a maximum of 45 minutes, followed by discussion. Feel free to post any questions and comments into the chat during the lecture and to speak up and voice your question on camera in Q&A time. I'm now delighted to introduce today's speaker, Axel Bohmann from the University of Freiburg. Axel is assistant professor in English linguistics in Freiburg. He earned his PhD in English at the University of Texas at Austin in 2017, and his dissertation was on register variation in global varieties of English. A sociolinguist by training, Axel specializes in language variation, world Englishes, register analysis, and computer-mediated discourse. He has collaborated in some of these areas with Lars Hinrichs from the University of Texas, who was originally scheduled to present today, but unfortunately had to withdraw. Axel draws on his expertise in the quantitative analysis of language variation and change to study digital language data from social media and discussion forums. And his talk today will be on linguistic dynamics in digital diaspora communities on the example of Nairaland, a transnational online community. So thank you very much for being with us. Axel, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Androutsopoulos, for this very kind introduction. I am delighted to be here, even though it sadly means Lars Hinrichs had to cancel out, or rather vice versa, the causality is a bit backwards. But anyway, I'm delighted to present on some ongoing work on the Nairaland corpus. Before I start explaining what it is that I'm doing, I need to start with a couple of acknowledgements. So some of the analysis I'll be presenting, I had a lot of help from student research assistants, Fatlum Sadiku and Panayota Papavasileou, who were employed through the project Language as a Complex Adaptive System, Insights from Physical Modeling, generously funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, which was a joint project together with my brother Martin, who's a physicist, and Lars Hinrichs, whom Yanis Androutsopoulos already mentioned. I also want to very gratefully acknowledge Professor Christian Mair, who collected the data that I'll be working on today, and who's always eager to share his data and allow other people access to them. And I'd like to also acknowledge Mirka Honkanen, my colleague here in Freiburg, with whom I did some of the analysis that I hopefully will get around to presenting. So some of what I'll be presenting is joint work together with Mirka. A little bit of background in terms of theory. So this talk is situated in the context of digital diaspora communities. And when we think about diaspora communities, there's a very obvious meaning or very obvious significance to digital mediation. It obviously kind of facilitates communication across space, right? Helps communities stay in touch with each other. But beyond this maybe intuitive notion, it's centrally involved in a lot of other processes having to do with super diversity, migration, and diaspora as well. So digital media allows speakers to be inserted into multiple contexts at once. Arnaud and Spotty talk about simultaneity as an important element of super diversity, where diaspora speakers being globally connected digitally are inserted into regimes of positionality and regimes of language use, both in the host society and through their connectivity with their home society or their homeland. The integration of diaspora discourses, diaspora cultural values, spaces into everyday practices in the host society. So once again, this relates to this notion of simultaneity. And Androtsopoulos and Alexander especially show that in these contexts, there are complex processes of norm orientation to multiple centers, where it's not just a tension maybe between the host and the homeland, host society and homeland, but very complex, digitally diverse, multi-layered kind of orientation to different centers of cultural and linguistic normativity. What's important for this talk is that all this happens in real time. Communities and contexts develop, and this is something that's not as frequently studied as one might hope, I think. So in this context of super diversity, the notion of the historicity, the chronotope, the specific trajectory of communities, individual discourses, etc., is something that's at the theoretical level highlighted quite a bit. But very often studies of digital diasporas look at heavily situated contextualized analyses, which are, I'm not here to say anything critical about these. I'm just saying this historical dimension is one that adds a certain value to the contextualization of this kind of analysis. Specifically, I'm going to look at one particular online forum that facilitates diasporic communication. This is the Nairaland forum. I kind of used the banner of the forum as the title here, so you can grab a couple of statistics off it. So it has nearly 3 million members, over 7 million topics, very active forum serving Nigerians both in Nigeria and anywhere else in the world. In terms of what this forum looks like, I think of it as kind of a mixture of Reddit and Craigslist, if you know these two. So Reddit, kind of a general interest, multi-purpose forum where people can just exchange ideas, and Craigslist, a platform where people sell their used stuff, try to organize certain events, but a lot of business activity going on as well. The forum is multilingual, largely text-based. It does include, it includes the possibility of including pictures and a limited range of emojis, but it's really text-based. It's highly interactive, stylistically heterogeneous, a lot going on, and importantly, it contains non-standardized digital writing, which is super interesting in a case like Nigeria, where you both have Nigerian English, which might be developing its own norms, as well as an English lexifier pidgin language, Nigerian pidgin, which lacks a writing system, but is transported into the written context. So there's norm negotiation going on there. So this forum has been turned into a corpus made accessible through a web interface by a project completed by Christian Mair and Stefan Fender some time back, and has been richly used since then. I'll go into some of the literature in just a bit. It's important to note that this is not a corpus in the traditional sense. This is not sort of representative structured data. This is all grabbing all of Nairaland by the horns, basically, and working with the data. So that brings a couple of added challenges with it, but also exciting real life data, right? So research on Nairaland so far has been mainly, has consisted mainly of qualitative investigations of language ideologies, narratives of belonging, labels of different ethnicities, modes of pidgin writing normativity, but also kind of trajectories of pidgin acquisition, especially for the for people outside of Nigeria. And all of this research has played a huge role in the theoretical development of models in world Englishes, and particularly Mair's world system of Englishes. So really, really exciting and interesting research that I would encourage anybody to have a look at, but very much from a qualitative perspective. Since this is a corpus, one might expect a bit more quantitative analysis, but there's really not as much going on as might be expected so far. There's a cool paper by Mirka, Honkanen, and Julia Müller on Nigerian versus English language surprise interjections. It's a very specific variable in the Nairaland corpus, but a longitudinal perspective is largely absent so far. So the notion of how does this community develop? How do their norms develop? How do they negotiate? Who's part of it? Who's not part of it? Etc. Mirka and I have a forthcoming paper on pigeon use, on how that develops, and I'll provide a couple more pointers or analyses in this talk. Since the goal of DiLCo is to bridge the qualitative and quantitative sort of perspectives, I do just want to quickly include this this example here of one post from the forum that sort of highlights the interaction of linguistic globalization, the vernacular, kind of the performative nature of the forum, right? So this is titled Strictly Niger Rap, Pidgin English Rap. So it's rap discourse, people performing their lyrics in the written medium, flagged as using Pidgin English. So there's, you have a confluence of different linguistic resources from different centers of normativity. So you have rap discourse heavily influenced by African-American English, right? You got the "ite," you got the "what up fellas," which might be a bit more generic American, but you could probably read that as African-American as well. And then a lot of pidgin use, right? This is flagged after all, right? Myself get rap lines, you subby rhyme tight. Fourth line here, I showcase wit in day upstairs. Right, so there's a lot of use of the vernacular intermixing with global linguistic resources, but also global forms of discourse. So it's kind of, one can see how this is exciting to study in terms of, we have a new medium where all these things are being negotiated. Now, this is the kind of data that, have been discussed quite at length. Sort of, the thing is, this isn't the only kind of discourse that happens on Nairaland. It's quite, it's huge, and there's a lot of quotidian stuff going on as well that maybe isn't prima facie as exciting to look at, but I think it's important to consider all of these discourses to see kind of, where is the language, its norms, its communication developing on the forum as a whole. So that's what I'll be tackling mostly today in this talk. So the research questions, largely exploratory. I don't have any specific hypothesis I'm testing here. It's one question with a couple of sub-questions. What happens over time in terms of participation on the forum? How much is going on and who participates? In terms of diasporic interaction, what's the intensity and quality of diasporic interaction? And probably most importantly, in terms of the attendant linguistic developments, which ways of using language solidify themselves, which maybe are explored and then dropped, etc. And I'm going to not talk about method very much. This is a short talk, and I want to pack quite a bit of information into it. Whenever the method is unclear, I'm obviously happy to talk about it in the discussion, but I'll try to kind of really focus on what's going on. Here is the kind of plot you'll be seeing for the rest of the talk. We have an x-axis that represents the time arrow, starting at 2006. So we have data dating back to early 2005, but there's really so little going on that it's difficult to do a lot of robust quantification. So I decided to start 1st of January 2006. And then on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you have various measures of whatever that graph wants to explore. So this graph is just how many words were posted to the forum per day. Each green dot here is the count for one day, and then the blue line is a regression smoother that just gives the average trend line. And so we see a steady increase right up until about 2012, and then quite a marked further increase, right? It's a sort of bend in this plot. So this is important to take note of, because I think this is a moment that influences a lot of what's going on Nairaland. At some point in 2012, a lot more activity happens, and when we look at what accounts for that activity, we can look at the extent to which people from different countries post to the forum. And you can see that it's really, when you look at the around 2012, the line for the US dips slightly, the UK almost horizontally, maybe slightly dipping. It's really the Nigerians that post to the forum. So if we look at these 4 lines, right, we have users from Nigeria, from the UK, US, and from anywhere else in the world, really, is what the red line is. You see maybe up until around the end of 2006, early 2007, heavily diasporic interaction, right? No one color dominates, there's a lot of mixing. And then there's this gradual rise of the Nigerian segment of the forum population taking over, and then that really explodes and speeds up around 2012. So this is the general dynamic of user participation in the forum, and what I want to explore is what linguistic consequences this development has. So the first thing I'm going to look at is really just a couple of individual words as by ways of example. Oh, actually, this probably helps as well. It's kind of the same display, but it shows the 4 different regions plotted, each on its own with different ranges on the y-axis, so one can better see sort of what the developments are. And what you see is this for the US, for other, and to some extent also for the UK, the sort of peak around 2006, right, where the percentage that they contribute in terms of discourse on the forum is very high. And then the UK actually manages to hang on, and participation is actually at a peak around 2010. But for people from other countries as well as from the USA, it really peaks in 2006 and kind of is a decline since then. And for Nigeria, you see the corresponding dip. These are percentages, right? So it makes sense that they're a bit inverted. A bit of a dip around 2006. It's really only about less than 40% of the text written to the forum is from Nigerian users. By 2014, we're at 80%. Just once again to highlight this development. All right, now I want to look at frequency change in individual words. And the challenge here is seeing the forest for the trees, because this is a corpus of nearly 1 billion words. How does any one individual word, how do we make sense of that? Well, we can look at it in individual ones, and I picked ones that are moderately interesting. So there's the token guys with a Z spelling, which we see on the y-axis. We have normalized relative frequency. So this isn't an absolute value, it's just relative to other times in the timeline, is it more or less frequent. So we see it's frequent early on, dips right until about 2008, and then it just doesn't play much of a role anymore. So it's a kind of rapidly and early declining form. And then we can look at another potentially interesting form, anoda, which is a written representation of not necessarily Nigerian Pidgin. It's more Nigerian English phonology, right? Another represented to approximate Nigerian phonology, which shows a steady pattern of increase, and particularly an increase in sort of the rightmost third of the data. Now we could do this for the tens and hundreds of thousands. Well, I'm really only looking at a couple 10,000 individual tokens, which are the most frequent ones. But obviously, like you end up with a messy plot. So we need a method to make sense of that tells us that, should be moving back, that guys and anoda looks very differently, that these two curves, right, they're almost inverse. But then other words might show very similar curves. So we could speculate that a word like oda for other shows a very similar distribution to anoda. And we want a method that automatically tells us, here's one group of words that shows a frequency development in this way, and one that shows another frequency development. And what I do for this is time series clustering. It's just really representing every word as a list of frequencies over time. And then these lists are basically the coordinates that you use to cluster the words. You find, you let a computer algorithm find patterns of similarity in the data. This is what this looks like. Maybe looks a bit squiggly and unappealing, but what's important to note about this is these are 12 lines that represent the 12 common patterns of how words develop in the data. And that, you know, gives you a rich point of entry, I think, in terms of reading how the forum in general develops. I color-coded them non-randomly, right? So there's 3 red ones that I would say they're generally rising patterns, and there's the purple ones, and the bottom right one might be grouped among these as well, that are the dipping patterns, the losing items. Blue is whether there's really no very significant pattern over time going on, and bottom left corner of the graph here we have cluster number 6. The large confidence interval, the shaded gray area, tells you that this is just probably a lot of words that are all over the place. It's most of the corpus words that just don't do much over time. And then in green, we have patterns of local peaks. There's a group of words that cluster 7, bottom row, second from the left, for example, that's really frequently used around 2011. Not as frequently before and after. So those can be, words that relate to specific events, specific people of general attention at the time. Now, in principle, you could look at each of these clusters and sort of make sense of what the words are in there. I'm only going to look at 2 here to kind of show what the analysis can do. So this is cluster number 3. This is one of the rising clusters, and if you've paid attention so far, this figure should look kind of familiar to you, right? So we have a slight increase up until around 2012, and then a sharper increase. Now, I'm plotting over this. Well, first I'm going to show what terms are part of this cluster. So it has a lot of words in there that relate to business, warranty, accessory, Nigerian proper nouns, achebe, chibuzor, technical terms like VPN, techno, GPU, and political terms as well, insurgents, defection, etc. What I really wanted to show, finally, numerals as well. So it's very referential. All of these, most of these, I think even all of them are, except the numerals, are nouns, or at least nouny words, right? So very content-focused interaction. Nigerian focused interaction, which you can see in the proper nouns. And if you did more of a sort of a deeper analysis of the political terms, you'd find out that the insurgents really, this relates to Nigerian news, but this is not necessarily obvious from the cluster. This is what I wanted to show really. So over the frequency graph for this particular cluster of verbs, I overlaid the daily word count on the forum. These things mathematically have nothing to do with each other, right? So the fact that they're patterning so nicely together tells us that this is really the change in discourse. This cluster captures the change in discourse that happens as the Nigerian user base takes over. And it's a very information-centered kind of discourse, and unsurprisingly, a relatively Nigerian content-focused kind of discourse. I also want to look at an inverse cluster. So this has relatively high frequencies around 2006 and up until, well, really goes down until by the end of 2006, early 2007. So this is the kind of early interaction where all the different diasporic groups are in a more intense conversation with each other. And it also has a pretty identifiable characteristic in terms of the words that are in there. It has emotional adjectives like funny, adorable, annoying, interjections like aw, creative spellings like guys, lengthening, so kind of vowel replacement for creative spelling like girl, and verbs of thought and communication, so what Biber would call public and private verbs, thinking, whispering, listening, which I would argue makes for a very different discourse characteristic compared to cluster 3 that we just saw that was rising and very information centered. This is clearly interaction centered writing, right? This is really people engaging on a personal note, and maybe potentially, but we'll see more about this, more actively disregarding the norms of standard English as well. Which brings me already to the next topic, Pidgin in the written medium, which I'm going to have to kind of really rush through to stay within the time limit. This is the work that I mentioned that I'm doing together with Mirka Honkanen, so credit is to her as much as to me. If it hasn't become obvious yet, Pidgin in the written medium is super interesting because Pidgin is an oral language that has no accepted standardized orthography, that hasn't been written historically, right? There are attempts at providing a writing system, at trying to codify it, and also, but parallelly, increasing written usage in various contexts, from church posters to public health brochures to obviously the kind of online context that I'm talking about here. What happens in these contexts, grassroots, in a grassroots perspective, is not necessarily always the same as what people propose in codification, which is something one often sees. And when it comes to sort of how Pidgin is negotiated on the forum, the creator himself had a very specific vision about the role of Pidgin on Nairaland. So this is, I think, the first post, or at least one of the first posts, in which Nairaland basically is introduced by Sion, who is the forum creator and host. And it says, Nairaland is an English language forum. English happens to be our official language in Nigeria. It also happens to be the language of the web. Please make every effort to use clear English at all times. Avoid netspeak or SMS language. You is spelled Y-O-U, not you. Avoid Pidgin English, but put them inside italics if you need to use Pidgin English. So if you do need to use it, kind of flag it as something that's in some way extraneous to your actual discourse, right? But we'll see that's not necessarily what people ended up doing. So what we do in this work is first we need to find a way to code for Nigerian Pidgin usage, which is not easy because it shares its lexicon with English, right? So many potentially English-looking words could be Pidgin or English. And so we worked in a sort of iterative way by collecting clear Nigerian Pidgin union bigrams, by just going through the literature, checking non-dictionary words in the corpus and coding them, looking at online dictionaries where they list particular Pidginisms, and then we use these lists to disambiguate multivalent unigrams. So if we have a unigram that's in an otherwise Pidgin context, then we treat that as Pidgin as well. That way we can sort of disambiguate English cognates. And come up with a Pidgin score for an individual text. And then this is iteratively used to bring up more potential Pidgin items. It's work in progress, but we're at a point where it's looking relatively robust, I would say. The list that we're currently working with has 702 Pidgin unigrams, 691 Pidgin bigrams, and a couple of ambiguous unigrams that are clarified by context, whether they contribute to a post's Pidgin score or not. So what we do, we score every post on the forum for its Pidginness. And the hypothesis might be Pidgin just isn't there if people follow Sion, or people really can use this as a medium to develop their Pidgin norms, and we see an increase of Pidgin use. And this is what we actually see. On the left, on the y-axis, we have the Pidgin score. The numbers themselves aren't very meaningful because we have a relatively limited set of items to calculate the score from. So when it's at 0.02, that doesn't mean it's only 2% Pidgin items used. It's really an approximation that we can't make direct numerical sense of yet. So much more important are the patterns than the absolute numbers. So what do we see in the patterns? Very clearly, early on, a rise in the use of Pidgin, right? Pidgin. Up until 2008, 2009, all of the users from different parts of the world use the forum to experiment with norms of Pidgin writing. And then that's really the peak in terms of overall usage. And then there's kind of various developments. So for the US, it really goes down pretty rapidly thereafter. The UK kind of as well. And it's really the other countries that maintain a pretty high level of pidgin usage. The people from the other countries, we've never focused on these a lot, but they're really interesting because they seem to cling to Nigerian standards a lot more compared to users from the UK or US who seem to kind of diverge over time. And then the Nigerian users, they also have a dip, but potentially a late resurgence of pidgin use. The point here is, the important point, I think, is that it's non-linear. It's not simply that the forum serves to promote pidgin use and that kind of develops over time or reaches a plateau and then stays the same. And there's dips and internal developments, and it's inconsistent across varieties. So users from different varieties end up doing different things and look more differentiated as time goes on. We can also look at this from the perspective of different topics. So Mirka came up with a, I think, 9-level topical differentiation of all the threads on Nairaland. And you can really see that you know, what's this big dip that we see at some point is really due to one or two specific genres. So it's not the fact, it's not true that Nigerian pidgin is vital and being used a lot all over the forum. We have fictional writing, the green line, with this massive peak here, and the general sort of, it's a lot of general discussion about general things, where we see this increase in pidgin usage. So it's really differentiated, subject to further exploration, which is what we're currently doing. I'm not going to go into any more of what's going on here. I really want to stress the point that these developments are non-linear and highly specific to both different users from different countries and different topics, which will then give me just enough time to explore the final aspect of the talk, and that's looking at linguistic variables over time. So we've looked at words, right? And words that cluster together and sort of what they tell us about the discourse in general on the forum. What I'm interested in now with the linguistic variables is less the overall character of the discourse, but more sort of the use of conventions and a lot of non-standard conventions of spelling. And in these, so linguistic variables are whenever you have a choice of expressing something one way or another, at least one or the other way. And in these, I'm particularly interested in divergence or potential convergence of the different user groups. I'm looking at 4 variables. They're motivated both theoretically and just from looking at the data and seeing that they, you know, they're frequent enough and their developments are interesting enough that there's something going on. And they represent different kind of processes. So there's Z, which is just mostly for plural words, usually ending in S, ending them with a Z. This can be guys versus guys, but also homies with several Z's versus homies. So there's an element, 2 different elements of creativity involved, of sort of flagging discourses potentially devious, something potentially associated with African-American English, although you'd have to work a bit harder to actually establish the direct connection here. Then a classic sociolinguistic variable. It's also been looked at in computer-mediated writing, the ing variable, going versus goin, morning versus morning, right? Something that's a general marker of informality, a time-tested sociolinguistic variable that is consistently conditioned across varieties of English. Then TH stopping, so the realization of, and here particularly I'm interested in intervocalic TH with a stop, with a dental stop, so anoda, alveolar stop rather, anoda versus another, weda versus whether, fada, moda, which approximates Nigerian pronunciation. And then vowel deletion, which is something that isn't phonologically conditioned, right? SHLD for should, KNW for no. It occurs a lot with modal verbs, must, will, etc., where just the vowel is completely deleted. which is obviously not phonologically motivated. This is a convention of computer-mediated discourse, and one that anecdotally, when going through the forum, struck me as quite specific to Nairaland. I'm aware that this sort of stuff happens elsewhere in CMD, but the frequency at which it happened, looking at Nairaland, and the context in which it happened, prompted me to think this is something potentially quite specific going on here. So for each of these variables, I extract all of the relevant contexts, and there are several millions in all cases. It's lots and lots of data. Look at them over time in the different user groups. I also did what you do when you're a good little sociolinguist. You run a logistic regression model to test for all the factors. I'm really only interested in the interaction of time and region, time and the place somebody comes from, and this comes out as highly significant with a large effect size in all 4 cases. So I'm not going to say any more about the models other than that what you see in the descriptive graphs is really important according to the model. So if we look at variable z, potentially the least interesting one, it just shows a very clear pattern that to the effect that it's frequently used early on and then pretty soon abandoned, really. The abandonment happens much more consistently in all other varieties except for Nigeria. Nigeria doesn't start off with a very high level of usage. So this can be interpreted as a variable or variant that's sort of brought in from diaspora speakers predominantly, and it sort of fails to catch on, right? There doesn't seem to be any indication that Nigerians particularly make use of it and increase it in their frequency of use, right? So one pattern of convergence, but convergence by the outsiders, the diasporic users assimilating to what the Nigerian users do all along. The ing variable, similar pattern really, a bit more going on. This is lots and lots of data. Obviously, any polysyllabic word ending in ing is a potential candidate here. But the general pattern again is relative stability for Nigerian users. Much higher frequencies of use for all other users, which then kind of quickly drops and actually undercuts the trend for Nigeria for most of the time starting from 2008, 2009. So here we have processes of where variables are initially used, but they're kind of being abandoned, and they're being abandoned. Maybe not because, but while Nigerians don't really, users from Nigeria, that is, shouldn't use Nigerians as the term here, users from Nigeria simply don't pick them up. If you compare this is really interesting. The TH stopping, anoda, moda, fada, shows a picture that's initially a bit similar. So we have the UK and other countries as relatively high users, and Nigeria, and interestingly the US, where I could have imagined this to feature quite frequently, not playing so much a role. But what you really see is differentiation over time and an increase in predominantly the user from Nigeria using this strategy. So this is, right after all, a writing strategy to approximate the phonology of Nigerian English. So that makes sense. But here we see this sort of more, I guess, Nigerian character of the written norms of Nairaland developing, and it's developing at a time where maybe the initially spectacular diasporic interaction has ceased to play so much a role. Part of my point in this talk is that these really spectacular identity-laden negotiations of positionality are super interesting, but once they kind of trickle out, there's still interesting stuff going on, and these long-term developments kind of need to be seen as an attendant and potentially a related development. Bringing these two things together is really important. And then we have variable vowel deletion. So this notion of should spelled SHD or SHLD, etc. And again, the predominant picture to point out is the rise in Nigerian English, and here it maybe most clearly we have this sort of additional upswing around 2012 when the Nigerian user base becomes more predominant. I'd really like to contrast this with some external data as well, something like Reddit, to see how the world in general is doing things as a point of comparison, because we don't have this here. And so far, it's only my feeling that this is something very specific to Nairaland and its frequency and in the kinds of words it's used in. But I think some of this you can see in this graph as well, that there's such a divergence between users from Nigeria and the British and UK users just sort of abandoning the strategy, essentially. Okay, this brings me to the conclusions. I did manage to stay to keep the time limit, if I don't stumble now. So there's significant change in both intensity, character, and linguistic style of interactions on Nairaland. I hope to have shown this, and I think it's something to be taken seriously when contextualizing individual interactions, which we should definitely keep doing, right? Looking at these individual interactions, these accounts of what does it mean to speak African American English? What does it mean to call yourself, I don't know, mixed, racially mixed, or whatever? But this also, these specific negotiations of these topics need to be seen against these general developments. And the development in general is from super diverse, right, participation at roughly numeric equal terms of people from different diaspora contexts to more mundane discourse, less interaction-centered writing, something that people in CMD like to study, more kind of mundane sharing of political news, posting of want ads, of items for sale, etc. But a lot of changes are not linear. It's not just this development that happens wholesale. It happens in these pockets of Nairaland, topical pockets, pockets in terms of non-linear developments, of user contribution or participation, etc. And the second but, which I think is really close to heart to me, less spectacular, less spectacular vernacular mixing, does not necessarily mean less interesting. A lot of these kind of solidifying norms of Nigerian writing, they're developing later on, and they bringing the spectacular anything goes situation in the beginning together with these more long-lasting trends. I think that will be a really productive way to further look at the data. One way to think of this might be as akin to a feature pool, right? At the beginning, the rules are very up for grabs, and basically all of the relative frequencies for all of the features, they're definitely there, especially the non-standard features. And then it's only some that get selected and actually manage to stay on, and others are simply abandoned. So this notion of an initially large feature pool and then competition among the features is something that I think could be productively applied here. That's for future research, though. This is really the end of the talk. Time is looking good. I've got 3 slides of references. Since this is a recording, I can leave each of them up for just a second. And I think that'll do.
Thank you so much, Axel, for this super interesting talk with good pace and timekeeping that leaves us about 15 minutes for discussion. Thanks you so much. And I'm now opening the floor for discussion, asking you to indicate a question by using your little yellow hands. I guess that would be the best. And trying to find, yeah, okay, so that's a good view of all participants. Let's see what happens in discussion. Heike Zinsmeister, yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I have just a question of understanding. Mm-hmm. So what was the granularity of the time steps?
Okay, so for everything but the words, that was daily. For all of the other stuff, it's monthly.
Okay. So it's rather fine-grained,
Rather fine-grained,
granularity.
yeah.
So you showed us that there's a peak with fictional literature, and I was wondering, I think it was between 2008 and 2012, and it corresponds to I don't know the English word, thruff, tal.
Trough,
yeah.
Yeah.
Trough. So maybe you could explain, do you see some correlations here? What is going on?
Which trough are we talking about?
So there was, I'm not sure, it was another bit later where there was, I think it was the pigeon use.
Okay, so the only slide that I have with these, which shows a differentiation according to topic, is this.
Yes, but but there was I think it was the pigeon use where it went down for the, I think for the Nigerian users, and I was wondering whether there's some correlation with the topics and the origin of the contributors.
Okay, so we have we're talking about fictional writing mostly, right?
Yes.
And I think sorry, my slides are moving terribly slow. You wanted to sort of contrast this with this slide here. This is just the pigeon use by the countries people are situated in.
Yeah, because here it's 2010, between 2012 there's this thruff. Yeah.
Okay. For everybody, basically.
Yeah, and I was wondering,
I don't have a very good answer for this. So basically, is the question, are people in the fiction genre from different origins using pidgin at different rates, or what's the interaction you have in mind?
Because I would have thought that that might be more frequent when there is, so I don't actually understand, because you said this is somehow relative scores. What determines that it goes up and down, and what is relative up and down. But for me, it was surprising that fiction is high, at least around the same time, but pigeon goes down, and pigeon use goes down, because I would have expected that this is something that, would be represented in fictional writing, because it's kind of, a way you can use that. I would have imagined that fictional writing would use it more.
And this is what you see here. So the height on the y-axis of this green line that represents fiction writing, that's not the word count of fiction writing, but that's the average pigeon score of pigeon writing in a given month, right? So we see that compared to all other topics, fiction writing, at least between 2008 and 2012-13, is the most pigeon friendly, the most receptive towards the usage of pigeon. So that is what we see. It's just the y-axis needs to be read not as, this is the amount of words that people at a given time use in pigeon writing, in fiction writing, but this is how strongly pigeon associated fiction writing is at a given point in time. That makes sense.
Yeah, still surprising that looking at the other slide, that this is at least about the same time frame, where I think that other one showed us more the word frequencies that it went down.
Okay, so you're not, sorry, my slides moved terribly slowly. This one. Okay, so here we also have, we have basically, if you think about, let's think about Nigeria,
yes.
As the users generally who contribute, right? We have an increase of pigeon right until around 2009. And then this decrease between 2009 and roughly 2011, 2012. And it's similar here. It is slightly, it's an interesting point you bring up. It's slightly out of phase, right? So this stuff happens later. So I can only speculate as to what that means. Would that mean, I can only speculate. But I think the correlation that we see is precisely that these two bumps explain each other. Or rather, this bump really, this peak here, explains a lot of the irregularities. And I'm waiting, a lot of sort of, at least this first part of the slide where it's like, whoa, going up and then down. This is really because in the fiction writing topic, there is very specific kinds of discourses that become, I don't know, en vogue, or that are developed that are really receptive to fiction writing. Incidentally, that's the qualitative exploration of what happens with fiction writing around that time is what we're doing right now, Mirka and I, for the paper, but we unfortunately don't have anything to report on that yet.
Any further questions? I think people are a bit overwhelmed of the from the size of the data and the density of the information.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. I think it's super interesting. Let's take Fabian Kniepen.
Yes, a very simple one.
Those are always the toughest.
No, it's actually very simple. I might have missed it at the start, but how did you determine origin countries? So Nigeria, UK, USA.
This is a question in the chat as well. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an important question to ask. With a bit more time, I should have explained this in the talk in a bit more detail. So there are user profiles, and people there's a location field in the user profile. There's not really a guarantee that people fill that information in, and B, that it's accurate. So there are two procedures, one of which I was part of and kind of developed, and the other one which actually preceded my working with the data. So before I worked with the data, basically the most active posters were tallied, the people who contributed most, and they were systematically searched by, their posts were searched by research assistants for strings like "here in Nigeria" or "I live in Lagos," etc. Right? So any self-disclosure in their actual posts to identify where they're located, and what we did when I sort of started working quantitatively on the project is we extracted the location information from all users' profiles and piped that to an API, sort of an application programmer's interface for Google Maps, and basically just fed it to Google Maps and got the geo coordinates back and the country information. So what's really nice about this is when you compare what these two methods say about the users that you have information from both methods on, in 95% of the cases the two methods agree, which is nice. It corroborates that neither of them is completely useless. You always have to take some noise into account, right? There's the inevitable fact that people aren't sedentary, that people move and may be in Nigeria when posting once and in the UK at some other time, and also the fact that sometimes people lie on their profile, right? Or maybe not lie is a stupid word. They maybe give information in a more aspirational than a factually oriented way, right? I mean, they might say they're from Lagos when they really mean that's what I associate with, etc. So we're overall pretty convinced of the general accuracy of this measure, but at the level of the individual user, you have to take each code with a grain of salt. I will say I also compiled a list of users with obviously mobile identity, so people who indicated several locations, etc., and flagged them for further analysis of what their discourses are in a much more qualitative manner. But that's in the large folder of work to be done in the future.
Thank you. Leonie.
Hi, wonderful. Thank you very much. I have a question that doesn't relate exactly specifically to the data that you've presented, but it's a bit more general. I'm interested in the notion of community, and I was wondering what your understanding of community is in this very complex context, of course, transnational dimensions and probably dimensions of practice. You were also speaking about the intensity of involvement and so on. So I was wondering whether you've looked at that or what your understanding of community is.
Yeah, I have a very quotidian sort of pedestrian understanding for the purposes of this talk of community here. I'm aware that Nairaland in general, this is not research that I've done, but that Nairaland in general is the discursive enactment of communities is definitely quite prevalent there. So I think mostly Teresa Haidt is the one who worked on this. On expressions like here in Nairaland or Nairalanders, right? Any use of terminology that indicates that this is a space akin to, you know, a physical community space, that there are labels for community members, etc. So I'm aware that this exists, and now that you get me talking about it, I think that will be something super interesting to study over time as well, because I do think the character changes from something from community, and we see that in these different time series clusters, right? The very interactional cluster and the much more informational transactional cluster, that potentially there's a shift from people perceiving this as a community and themselves as members of a community to something more of a service, a platform for exchanges, etc. Yeah, that's a good point. That definitely would be something worthwhile to investigate over time as well. Over time is the key, the operative word here.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see, we have another couple of minutes. I am tempted to put myself on the list, if I may, and I have the following question, again related to Pidgin, but also taking in assumptions from code switching theory, but also from what we know from multilingualism on the web. So theoretically, you can expect different patterns of Pidgin used online in written. One could be that you have entire messages in Nigerian Pidgin. The second could be something like mixed writing, like the example you showed in the beginning, where you have interconnected Pidgin at the, let's say, intranscendential level, but then interspersed with other stuff. And the third would be what also is very common online, a more chunky and formulaic use of Pidgin, where you have, you know, Pidgin in the brackets or for specific speech acts and speech moves. Do you have a way to compute sort of these, to figure out these three, let's say, different patterns of usage and to compute their frequency or their occurrence over time? That would be really fascinating, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great comment. It's along the lines of the direction that Mirka and I were thinking. We definitely have the expectation that, you know, Pidgin use among the people based in Nigeria and people in the diaspora might take on different forms. And I don't have the greatest solution yet. I think to do it quantitatively for all the data requires quite a bit of computational intelligence. But I mean, what you can do obviously is look at isolated Pidgin elements in an otherwise not obviously Pidgin post, especially, you know, in the right or left periphery, beginning or closing of the post. Potentially also overrepresented items in certain contexts, right? I mean, that how you day, which is how's it going, is represented, you know, speculating here, much more frequently overall in the diaspora compared to just more evenly spread Pidgin among Nigerian writers in general. So definitely something we need to look at. Tricky from a computational perspective. We don't have the best solution for it yet, but it's exactly the direction this should be going into.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, then we could perhaps bring this talk to a close. And thanks again, Axel Bohmann from the University of Freiburg for today's DiLCo lecture, a super interesting talk, and which will be available in about a week's time from Lecture to Go. to open access and to re-watch and share with others. And our next DiLCo lecture, we have 3 more for this year, will be on the 17th of November by Reinhild van der Kerkhofer from Antwerpen University. And we'll advertise that about 1 week before the time. Thank you so much for joining in, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
And Axel, if you could stay in, let's say,
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, all right. Cheers.